مباشرة إلى عرض مرئي حول تجارب منهجيات المشتريات المتقدمة ودلالتها في التحكم والمراقبة لعمليات سلاسل الإمداد. يقدم هذا العرض المتحدث الرئيسي السيد سام الشامبونغ في كبس، المدير الإقليمي للمعهد الملكي للمشتريات والتوريد لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال إفريقيا. سيد سام.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see so many people here and some excellent speeches. And it's good to see so many interesting initiatives that are contributing towards Saudi Vision 2030. So I'd like to thank all the dignitaries. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Riyadh again for this session. So, as you said, my name is Sam Achampong. I'm the Regional Director for the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. But you'll hear me referring to the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply as SIPS. So whenever I say SIPS, you know that's what I'm speaking about. It's just easier, that's all. It's a bit of a mouthful. So essentially, regardless of my job title, I'm a procurement and supply person. That's what I am by profession. That's what I do. And it's good to be amongst so many other procurement and supply professionals here today. So originally from the UK, I've worked across procurement and supply for several years, but I've also worked in procurement and supply prior to my current role as Regional Director for SIPS. I've worked in procurement and supply across this region for 8 years, so I have an understanding of the environment out here. So what am I going to talk about today? Essentially, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the profession of procurement and supply, which so many people here are procurement and supply professionals, and also about how it integrates into supply chain and logistics, and where SIPS fits into this whole picture as well. So that's what I'm going to cover today. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to ask or ask me at the end. Quite happy to take questions at any particular time. So before I go forward, who are SIPS? Who are the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply? What do we do? This is who we are. First and foremost, we are a chartered institute, which defines us from being any other type of institute. And for those who are aware, a chartered institute means that you are the institute that represents that profession. So there can't be two chartered institutes for any profession. So we are the Chartered Institute for Procurement and Supply. We are the largest global institute representing the profession of procurement and supply. So that's what we are first and foremost. Our remit, our role within procurement and supply and across the globe is what it says up there. We were set up in 1932 for the single purpose of promoting and developing, for the public benefit, the art and science of procurement and supply. So that's what we do. That's our only remit. We're here to promote procurement and supply. We are also a charity. We provide scholarships to a number of people around the world, including in this region, who perhaps cannot afford an education in procurement and supply. So that's our charity side. We're also an awarding body. So like any other university across the world, we are an awarding body. So our qualifications are credit-bearing qualifications. So if you have the professional diploma in procurement and supply, that is equivalent to a master's degree. In credit terms, our chartered status qualification is equivalent to an MBA in credit terms, so you can swap those credits for any educational establishment around the world. So that's what we do as an awarding body. But over and above that, we also license a number of institutions or universities around the world to carry our qualifications. So we license a number of universities in this region and around the world to carry our qualifications, and or we license their qualifications because we would have reviewed them and agreed that they are legitimate qualifications for a procurement and supply professional. For SIPS qualifications, and that's not the only thing we do, but for SIPS qualifications, there's about 80 to 90,000 people every year around the world who take SIPS qualifications. So we are the largest professional body representing procurement and supply. We're also a membership organisation, so you don't have to study in procurement and supply. You can be a SIPS member, and many people around the world are. We have a global community of about 120,000, and SIPS members are simply professionals who maintain their membership with us, but there are requirements around that. SIPS members take annual ethics tests, for example. They sign up to a code of conduct. So we regulate the industry for those who are SIPS professionals. And we work with a number of organizations in the kingdom and around the Middle East, and a number of them are SIPS members, aside from the actual companies. Essentially, we are also a business, so we do provide advisory services to organizations who use our services as well. So we've worked with a number of organizations in the kingdom, around the region and around the world on how they do procurement and supply. We're able to carry out advisory services with them and advise them what is best in class, what is best practice, what is ethical procurement, what is the best technology in procurement, on a benchmark with similar organizations around the world. Okay? So we work with several organizations in the region to do that. I said we're global. Yes, we are. SIPS operates in over 180 countries in the world through study centers and universities. We have over 250, I believe, at the moment, universities, and another 200 study centers around the world, including here in the kingdom, where you can study for SIPS qualifications. Aside from that, we have 6 regional offices. So we have 6 corporate offices around the world, headquartered in the UK. We have a Middle East and North Africa office, which is the office that I manage, and we have other offices in Australasia, in Singapore as well, and in South Africa. Interestingly enough, we also have partner offices. So we have an office within, for example, within the United Nations. We have partner offices within the UNDP as well. We have partner offices within the World Bank for their procurement collaborations. So that's what we do from a global footprint. And this just summarizes the different services we carry out. So capability development is training. So we do training and qualifications. And I need to be careful because I'm going to trip over on this carpet. So we do training and development as well. But we also, if you look at the performance bit, we work with organizations to look at how they do procurement. We look at ethical procurement. We look at things like sustainability in procurement as well, fraud advisory services, and just enhancing the capability of the organization as well. So that just summarizes that. And everything we do is backed by what we call the SIPS Global Standard, which is a document that is updated by SIPS every 9 to 12 months. Every 9 to 12 months, we revisit the document called the SIPS Global Standard, which defines what is best practice in procurement and supply chain. We update that every 9 to 12 months. And there's a very good reason why we do that. And the reason why is because the world changes. And in the last 5 to 8 years, the world has probably changed quicker than it's changed at any other time in history. The changes in the world these days are rapid. So it's very, very relevant that SIPS revisit our advice, our advisory services on a very, very regular basis. So if you look at the global environment, this is what the world looks like these days. There are different requirements that we have from our stakeholders from the business environment on us as business professionals. And if you look at procurement and supply, we have changing expectations. That's first and foremost. Our main stakeholders, CEOs, have a different requirement for procurement and supply professionals in 2017 to 2018, leading up to 2020. And in our discussions with CEOs, they all say to us, globally, 48% of them say, we believe that the title Chief Supply Chain Officer or Chief Procurement Officer has to be a boardroom position by 2020. That's what CEOs tell us as an institute. They say that position cannot be a position that sits outside of the boardroom anymore, because supply chain is pivotal to what every organization does these days, as we've been discussing this morning. It's vital. And it's the industry, it's the stakeholders, it's CEOs who are saying to us, the profession, that they require a chief supply chain officer to be sitting in their board as a key position. And I'll talk in detail a little bit later about why that is. But essentially, this is what people are saying to us. We need chief supply chain officers, C-level executives representing procurement and supply in our board. I know 3 chief supply chain officers in the Middle East. So we've got a long way to go. There aren't only 3. I'm just saying I know 3. I don't know everyone, but I know 3. That's not enough. CEOs are saying to us that position, someone who has that strategic direction in supply chain, has to be in our board. Apart from that, the world is changing anyway. Commodities are changing. There's a proliferation of oil and gas. Oil and gas was dominant. But what will be the dominant commodity in the future? We don't know. I've put up there lithium. That's a guess. I'm only saying that based on the fact that everyone seems to want electric cars these days. Everyone wants electric cars. Batteries are made from lithium. Is that going to become a scarce commodity in the future? Is it going to become the need to have commodity in the future? We need to know that, because that's going to define costs in the future, and it's going to define supply chains in the future. However, supply chains are in a way less important than they were before, because the flip side is we now have 3D printing. 3D printing changes supply chains to a large extent because you're not distributing prototypes around the place. Raw materials don't always need to be transported for prototypes and for other uses. 3D printing has already taken care of that. People in the construction industry are 3D printing houses these days. In the medical industry, they're using 3D printing. It's changed everything. And I know when I first heard about this term maybe 6 to 7 years ago, it seemed so far away that I never thought it would become a reality in my lifetime. But 3D printing now is almost the norm in some industries, especially the medical industry. It's almost the norm. Big data is very, very important. Companies now are differentiated by how much data they're able to manage. Your company may be better than his company or her company just by the fact that they have access to data. They know how many pens they bought last year and from which supplier they bought it from and how much they paid. And it's amazing how many organizations don't have access to that. But those that do, those who are able to crunch big data, are the ones that will survive and the ones that would perform. Like Amazon. Amazon know everything that happens across the Amazon warehouse and in their inventory, and Amazon are the biggest retailer globally by far, because they have access to big data and they can crunch that big data. On other issues around the world, how else is the world changing? Well, it's interesting because, it's interesting to me anyway, because these are the kind of things that interest me. But public procurement. There used to be a trend, I remember back in the UK in around 1998-ish, there was a big trend towards away from public procurement. There was a lot of public-private partnerships where the government was trying to divest of its assets so that the government is not the biggest procurement department, handing over to the private sector. And that's almost happening in different timescales, in different decades, in different parts of the world. However, the overall trend is that globally, we are actually moving back towards public procurement. A lot of sovereign states are regaining control of their procurement budgets centrally for different reasons, for consolidation reasons, for political reasons, but public procurement is becoming key again. Public procurement is becoming very, very important. It depends where you are as to whether that's a good or bad thing, but essentially it means that procurement is directed in one particular area, and if a particular government has control of procurement and takes a different policy towards trade, that has an effect on everybody else. And I'm talking about protectionist measures, trade tariffs, things along those lines. That's again how the world is changing, and I'll talk about a little bit more about that as we go on. Ethics and compliance are big at the moment. Previously, there wasn't that much reliance on how ethical you were when you bought something from a particular part of the world. In this day and age, people want to see sustainability. They want to see renewable goods being bought. They want to know where you bought those wooden items. Were they from renewable sources? They're very, very interested in that. So as procurement and supply professionals, we need to take that into account as well. Overall, I guess the biggest change to business in general is this ideas economy. Back in the day, not long ago, business was a little bit more simple. The successful organizations owned an awful lot of assets, and that was pretty much it. The biggest hotel chains owned the most hotels, and the biggest transport companies owned the most taxis, and it goes on. The biggest broadcasting organizations had the most premises and the most staff. But we all know, and I guess we've spoken to death about terms like Uberization. We've heard about Uberization. I'm not going to labor the point. But it does show that these days, the successful companies are based on ideas and ideas only, as opposed to ideas and assets as they were before. Because Airbnb, as an organization, doesn't own any hotel rooms, but actually controls more hotel rooms across the world than the Marriott Group. In the same way that some of the big broadcasters, maybe the BBC or NBC or OSN or any of the other channels, own a lot of assets. They create their own content, but they also own a lot of assets, buildings, staff, and people. So how do they compete against Netflix? It's the same principle, because Netflix don't have that cost base, but they're still in the same market. So that's how business has changed. But the biggest change for the procurement and supply profession is that in this day and age, if you have a procurement and supply function or a department, it's no longer acceptable for that function to be a cost center. That's the biggest change globally at the moment. So if you have a procurement and supply team of 10 people or whatever, previously that was always a cost center. You have the cost of staff, you have the cost of IT and everything else. It was a cost center like any other administrative department. In this day and age, it's no longer acceptable for your procurement team to be a cost center. They have to be a profit center. They have to be a net profit center. And it's not all about that team making savings anymore, making year-on-year savings. That is just a given. Of course you need to make savings as a procurement or supply chain team. But you have to be a profit center. And organizations now have procurement teams who are paying, in effect, net dividends back to the organization by adding value to the organization and not being a cost. That's the biggest change in procurement and supply in reaction to how the world is moving. And there are several organizations that have already fully implemented this. And that's the challenge for your procurement and supply professionals and the heads going forward. That's the biggest challenge. An investment, not a cost. But aside from that, if you look at everything here, the biggest change in the global community and the environment and the economy, most of the changes there centered around technology, if you noticed. Most of the things centered around technology, big data, 3D printing, etc. So if you look at the world, this is a rough trade route map. We would all probably concur that we now live in a connected world, a global community, a global village, as people say, where trade is flowing freely or freer than it ever did before, and we're all now very connected, right? Would everyone agree with that? Would everyone agree that our perception now is that we live in a more networked time than we ever did before? Global village. Let me just show a show of hands. Global village, we all think we're networked? Okay? Right. So let me assume that everybody else thinks we are not more connected as a world than we ever were before. Yeah? I'm just assuming that everyone who didn't put up their hands says that we are not in the most connected stage we ever were in history. Well, that's good, because I didn't put up my hand, because actually, despite the fact that we have more technology, more transportation, more logistics around the world than we ever did before, we are probably the least connected than we have been ever in history. We have all the trade routes, we have the technology, we have the logistics, but then we also have human beings, you and I. And we create these trade barriers around the world that mean that we're not as connected as we should be. So you have tariff barriers, you have non-tariff barriers. If you look at this map, we're talking about trade barriers in North America, okay? Donald Trump. You have non-tariff barriers in certain parts of Africa, which means that trade is free. You can move things freely. However, there are areas of there are some logistical issues in certain parts of Africa which hamper the free movement of trade. So there's probably not as much trade as there could be if those areas were dealt with. Then you have non-tariff barriers coming out of Asia going into Australia. It's probably just too far away, or whatever the reason. And then you look at somewhere like the UK, where you have perceived protectionist measures, Brexit, things along those lines. So actually, trade does not move as freely as it should do. Trade does not move around the world as freely as it should do. And actually, SIPs issue what we call the quarterly risk index in association with Dun & Bradstreet, and it shows, as I said before, that supply chain risk around the world, the measure of supply chain risk, the CRI, the SIPs risk index as we call it, is at its highest point ever in history. It's double since 2008 when we last had a financial crisis in this region and around the world. Okay? So because of the additional barriers to trade, the SIPs risk index is double what it was before. And that the SIPs risk index measures things like economic outlook, business continuity, nationalization risk, things along those lines. And it concludes that we're at the highest rate ever. So we don't live quite in as connected a world as we think we do. However, I think it's important to know that that will never remain, because through decades or less than decades, there will be a way that trade reconverges and makes ourselves as accessible as possible going forward. Because where trade barriers are put in place, naturally, trade always goes around those. So I'll use one example, and it's not an absolute example, it's an assumption, I have to say, caveat. If you look at the UK, previously we had a protectionist measure there, according to my chart, but if you do a quick simulation on that as to how trade may go, then the likelihood is that trade routes will bypass the UK if something like Brexit remains. Okay, it's not a fact, but I'm saying those are the behaviors of trade routes. So where barriers are put in place, trade routes move. Okay? If you look at maybe where we've got Africa down the bottom, it may be that trade bypasses that route. Again, it's not an absolute, because there's a lot of things in Africa that have been done in terms of infrastructure, and they are transforming and making that more of an attractive trading location. Where we've got trade barriers in North America, well, North America is a big place, and people bypass those trade barriers sometimes. So that just gives a very quick outlook on how trade revolves, and it shows that we're not as connected as we should be. Bear in mind, we have the likelihood, or the luxury of technology. We're not as connected as we should be. But we should be, because supply chain, as we all know, is by far the most important element of business in this day and age. It's the differentiator between one business or another. The only difference between those businesses are how effective their supply chains are. It's as simple as that. Yet, having said that, 83% of CEOs believe that their supply chains are not optimal to meet today's demands. So 83% of CEOs are saying our supply chains are not good enough. Okay? Supply chains are that important to organizations, but the vast majority of CEOs, let's just say all of CEOs, right, are saying our supply chains are not optimal enough. That's, if we go full circle, that's why they're saying we need a chief supply chain officer at board level. We need to do a lot better. It's not acceptable. It's hampering business in the year 2017 towards 2020. 81% of businesses experienced at least one supply chain disruption last year. 81%. Supply chain disruptions are not a trivial thing. If something is defined as a supply chain disruption, it means it's something that affected your supply chain and had a significant effect on your business. Yet 81% of businesses experience those. The businesses who have very, very strong supply chains, supply chain management, supply chain personnel, and supply chain represented at board level do not have serious disruptions in their supply chain. But you won't hear about these organizations, because if you don't have a disruption in your supply chain, it means you have mitigating measures in place, so no one's going to hear about you. But you will be a successful business. So it's those, it's those almost 19% of businesses have very, very strong supply chain management, but they're successful businesses. Only 15% believe their supply chain is resilient enough to address external disruptions. That's a very, very low number. Okay? And this is globally, by the way, so it takes into account regional variations. Yet, despite those four preceding questions, only 60% of organizations, or 60% of CEOs, believe that they, or say, 60% of organizations say they pay only marginal attention to supply chain risk. So the disruptions in their supply chain are their own fault. They should pay a lot more attention to risk. Because supply chain risk, as I've said before, is a very, very serious thing. Supply chain risk is not a joke. Supply chain risk or supply chain disruption will cripple your organization. And not many people pay attention to that. I've pulled out a few examples spanning maybe a decade, and I've taken them out, I've shown them because of how representative they are of supply chain risk. Okay? So if you look in the year 2000, we've got Ericsson. In the year 2000, Ericsson were probably the biggest supplier of mobile handsets, mobile telephone handsets. They were a market leader, Ericsson were. No one remembers them now for being market leaders, but they were in the year 2000. And what happened was, there was a fire at the factory that provides Ericsson with microchips. Okay? There was a fire. They lost the ability to get one of their most important components for their phones. Just because, and I say just because, they had a fire in their factory. Based on that, they lost their market leadership position in mobile handsets, and they never recovered. Okay? That's the supply chain disruption. that needn't have happened. And I'll come back to that in a second. If you look at the sportswear company Nike, or Nike, depending on which part of the world you're from, I say Nike. Well, Nike, again, they had another supply chain risk. Nike, it was found out in the year 2008 that some of the people who worked in Nike's factory were underage, under the age of 18. The reputational damage that they suffered as a result of that cost them hundreds of millions of dollars, just by that reputational fact alone. Just because it was reported that some people working in the Nike factory were under 18. That's a supply chain disruption. That's a supply chain risk that should have been mitigated. And then we go to Tesco's. Less known, I guess, but Tesco's are or were the biggest retailer in the United Kingdom and one of the biggest in Europe at one stage. The biggest retailer in the UK. They got to a position where it was found that in the burgers they were selling, there were traces of horse meat. In the burgers they were selling in their stores, in their shops. As a result of that, when that came out in the newspaper, on the first day of that scandal, Tesco's lost £300 million on the value of their organisation on the first day. So on the day that news broke, they lost £300 million. 369, maybe a billion reals. Okay? Again, they could have mitigated that. But how did that happen? By the way, they lost that on the first day. As a result, they probably had to close 200 stores around the UK and Europe. Okay? And it goes on and on. So that was the limit of it. That was the initial damage. Okay? It was catastrophic. So how did that come about? That's reputation. That actually is bad procurement and supply chain practice, because with Tesco's, actually what happened there is they had buyers who were working with suppliers, and all they continue to do is say to the suppliers, we want you to sell this beef to us for cheaper, cut the price, 10% cheaper year on year. That's what they were doing. And eventually the suppliers were having to supply meat to Tesco's at a price lower than it cost them. Okay? Below cost price, they were having to do that. And they would continue to do that, because if they didn't do that, they would lose a contract with the largest retailer in the UK. So they're not going to do that. Okay? Probably common sense says they will not do that. Ethics says maybe they should have. But as far as I'm concerned, as a procurement professional, the ethical issue is on the side of Tesco's and on the side of their on the side of their buyers. It is unethical to do that to a supplier. To put a supplier in a position where they have to provide something to you at less than cost price. And ethics are very important for many good reasons. Okay? One is that it's just good to be ethical. It's the right thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it costs you money not to be ethical. Because, as I said, they've been unethical to their suppliers. That has led to an integration of horse meat into their supply chain. That has led to the scandal that broke. That has led to them losing almost 1 billion reals, closing 200 stores. So, they maybe saved 10% year on year on the unit price of beef. Okay? Maybe they did. Maybe they made savings year on year and they made the organization happy. You know, being a procurement and supply guy, hey, I've made some more savings this year and I made savings last year. But what use is that when you've just basically had to close 200 stores? That's the result of ethics. That's the result of a supply chain disruption. And if I go back and talk about some of the other things, this talks about how far we look down our supply chain, because let's face it, with the Nike example, Nike, the people who were under the age of 18 working in the factory for Nike, they were in Brazil. Okay? It was not illegal to employ people at the age of 16 in Brazil. That's where the Nike factory was. But it's illegal in the United States, or for that particular profession. And also, not only is it illegal, Nike have in their corporate brochures saying that they do not employ anyone under the age of 18. Okay? Yet people in their factory in Brazil are under the age of 18. And the reason that happened is because of this, is because people do not look further than 1 or 2 tiers down their supply chain. You have a contract with your supplier, maybe you vet them and look at their trade license and look at where their factories are, but that's not where the product originated from. We have to have visibility all the way down our supply chain. And if Nike had done that, they would have had visibility all the way down to the factory in Brazil that employs these workers, and they would have noticed that that is a supply chain issue. That is a potential risk, a reputational risk, but a risk nonetheless that ended up costing them a lot of money. Okay? So not enough people, as it says there, look all the way down their supply chain. They look 1 or 2 tiers down, but you have to have control all the way down your supply chain. And if you don't, then you're subject to these same supply chain risks. And as I said before, it seems quite trivial, but supply chain risks cost money. And trust me, these are just some examples I've given you because they're quite high profile, but there are a lot more than that. And if you look at the, so we showed Tesco's, we showed Nike, but let's look at the Ericsson example as to how you look down the supply chain. Now, I guess you can argue that a factory caught fire, maybe you can't really mitigate against that too much, so it's just an unfortunate occurrence. But what I will tell you is that Ericsson, the factory that Ericsson got their microchips from, was the same factory that Nokia get their microchips from. It's no different. It's the same factory. They get the same product from the same factory. But the difference is that Nokia at the time had a very able supply chain team. It's as simple as that. And they had already looked at potential risks in their supply chain. And they already decided that, look, we're relying on one factory here. What if something happens? And they already had in place mitigating strategies in case, for whatever reason, they're unable to get microchips from this particular factory. So as it happened, when the factory caught fire, Nokia's risk mitigation strategies came in, and they were able to switch supply to somebody else. And they had no disruption whatsoever. And they continued being the leader in mobile handsets for a while anyway. Nokia are not around anymore, but they continued to have that market leadership position only because they paid attention to their supply chain and they eliminated risk. As I mentioned on the first slide, CEOs want a chief supply chain officer, and the number one reason is to mitigate risk. That's what they want them to do. They want them to mitigate risk. And if you don't, these are the sorts of things that can happen. So visibility all the way down the supply chain, these are the important things. And the key thing really is to use your supply chain as a differentiator. And whenever I talk about differentiators or innovation, I always use Apple as an example. Apple, as far as I'm concerned, have the most able, I think that's my phone, have the most able supply chain team that I'm aware of globally. And they use their supply chain as a differentiator. The difference between Apple and other companies is their supply chain. Because I remember when the iPod first came out, the iPod was not the best MP3 player on the market. It was good and it was nice, but it was not the best. The difference was the supply chain. Because if I walk into a shop, first of all, I could buy an iPod. Second of all, I could ask them to provide me one in my favorite color, which is yellow, by the way. And I could ask them to customize it and put my name on the back, because their supply chain can support that. So that's the differentiator as far as Apple are concerned, over and above the actual product. But apart from that, if you look at this example, Apple as an organization spend only 3.5% of their revenue as a percentage on research and development. And Apple make a lot of money, so 3.5% of their revenue is a lot of money anyway. But they spend 3.5% of their revenue on research and development. I say 3.5, I say only 3.5% of their revenue because their competitors spend an awful lot more, definitely in double figures, on research and development. So we talk about Facebook, we talk about Google, we talk about Samsung. They spend a bigger percentage of their revenue on research and development. So why do they do that? As it says there, it's just very, very simple. It's that Apple operate as a supply chain organization from start to finish, from top to bottom. Tim Cook, their CEO, was formerly their head of supply chain. They understand it, they get it. They use supply chain as a differentiator. So all they do is, with their key suppliers, which is not rocket science, they will go to, when they're designing the next Apple iPhone 11, or whatever it is now, they will simply go to their supplier and say, can you design the battery for the Apple 11? Simple as that. They've got a 10, 15, 20, 25, I don't know, 30-year agreement with their supplier. Doesn't matter what the length is, but they have a strategic partnership with the supplier. And they will say, go and design, go and provide me with a battery for the new iPhone 11. The supplier would use their own time, money, resources developing this. It's not costing Apple anything. Okay? But once it's completed, yes, Apple will buy it from them. Okay, so it's a win-win relationship. It's not, it's not one of those, take everything you can from the supplier. Apple will buy it from them. Apple will buy the battery from them. But Apple are not spending money on research and development time and money, and they're not using their staff. So just by applying the principles of supplier relationship management, which is all it is, Apple save, what is that, 10, 11, 15% of their annual revenue just by employing supplier relationship management, just by doing that, whereas a lot of organizations, by the time they come to invent their new phone, they would do it the traditional way. They would go to tender. They would get 3 or 4, 5 companies and say, how much will it cost you to provide us with the battery for our new phone? And they would do a tender perhaps, and they would get the most efficient, in their mind, the most efficient organization to provide that battery to them. They would win the tender, they would award the contract to this company, okay? And they will get an efficient price and an efficient supply chain. But what I can tell you is, at the end of this tender that they do, or this agreement, these other organizations, I can guarantee you that as a result of that tender exercise, that RFP, or whatever you want to call it, they would not have saved 10% of their revenue. They would not have made that amount of savings. They would not. It's as simple as that. So Apple are applying supply relationship management principles for very good reason. They're not doing it for the fun of it. It's because it saves money and it adds value to your organization. So as we always say in SIPs, and I'm going to go back in a second to that, as we always say in SIPs, we've gone past cost savings. Cost savings are a given. It's adding value to an organization. And Apple are very good at that. Another example of an organization are Adidas. Now, again, this is not rocket science, but Adidas introduced in Moscow, where they didn't have before, they introduced collect from store technology, which just means that if you go into a shop, you want to buy a pair of trainers, whatever, you want size 9, they don't have it, they will say, doesn't matter, we will get this to you in 2 hours. Okay, we'll either deliver it to you at home, or we'll deliver it to the store, and you can collect it in 2 hours. Okay? We're sorry we don't have size 9, but we will get it to you. Okay? Collect from store. That's all they did. It's not rocket science. And the way they facilitated it is because they did no longer rely on having faraway warehouses to deliver stock into the center of Moscow. They made each shop pretty much a warehouse. So if there's a shop 5 miles down the road and this shop doesn't have size 9, it doesn't matter. They'll call the other shop and they'll deliver your goods to you. Okay, so all they wanted to do was to have a more efficient supply chain. Okay, that's all they wanted to do. And typically, the outcome of having a good supply chain is you save costs. Okay, you're more efficient and you save costs. However, What they found is that just by doing this, they actually make money. So supply chain and procurement typically will save you costs. You'll save costs by implementing good procurement practices, but this actually generated money. And how did it do that? They found out that simply by delivering, when people order things online, if it takes 1 day to 2 days, 3 days or whatever, they found out that actually if you deliver something to someone within 24 hours, there's a 70% less chance that they will return that item. Okay? Just simple research they did. So as a result, they've actually increased their sales. They increased their sales by 100% just by delivering things on time. And in this day and age, it's the supply chain that is the differentiator. And I'll tell you, a live example. Here I was, came into Riyadh yesterday, Skyped my daughter back in the UK. While I was on Skype, she said, "Oh, sorry, the doorbell is ringing, I have to go." She went, came back a minute later. So I said, "What was that?" She said, "Oh, 5 minutes ago, I was trying to print something on the printer and I ran out of ink." So I said, "Okay, fair enough." So I went on to Amazon Instant and I ordered ink cartridges. And it came within an hour. Okay? It's not tomorrow, that's the world we already live in. So that's the differentiator. You're generating money by having a supply chain behind you in even the most basic products. It's as simple as that. So that's what Adidas did in Moscow, increased their sales. They didn't just reduce costs, they made money. So when we talk about the proliferation of technology, we always look at how technologies have killed certain industries. And here's a few examples. You know, if you look at Amazon, did Amazon kill other retailers? Pretty much, probably. Amazon is the biggest bookshop in the world. It's the biggest retailer in general in the world. Through technology, perhaps. And, you know, the music industry is pretty much, you know, not a market leader in their own commodity anymore because you have things like iTunes. You can buy music online. Uber, we know about. Uber has pretty much revolutionized the transport industry. You have, I don't know if anyone remembers Blockbuster video stores. I do. But you pretty much don't have them anymore. You know, you can get things from Netflix. But the point I'm trying to make about technology is that technology changes things. That's for sure. But technology is not the reason for the changes or for the death of a particular industry. It's not technology alone. It's the implementation of technology. So if you look at the Netflix example, it's not just because Netflix came along that your Blockbuster video store or whatever store disappeared. That's not the only reason. The main reason is because when I used to hire a video from a video store, if I took it back 3 days late, they would charge me. Okay? That's the problem. Okay? Let's forget about technology for a second. That's the problem. Because it's almost like, why are you charging me? I brought it back 3 days late, but you know, I borrowed this video. So it's not just technology. It's other things. If you think of iTunes taking over the music industry, it's not just because of the technology. It's because previously I'd have to buy a vinyl album which has 12 songs on it, and I would have to buy all of those songs. Okay, I'll have to buy the whole album, whereas iTunes said, no, you can choose which track you want. So it's not just technology, it's the application of technology. And if anyone saw, there was recently hurricanes in Miami, unfortunately, and a lot of people had to evacuate. Okay? And a lot of people now have Tesla cars. Okay? They have the electronic cars, Tesla, and a lot of people have them. And they have a range, the particular model, they have a range of about 60 miles before you recharge. Okay? So all these Tesla vehicles have to evacuate from Miami. Okay? 60 miles is probably not the ultimate range if you're going to evacuate. So what did Tesla do? Tesla simply downloaded a patch to their software for all Tesla cars in Miami to increase the range of the battery overnight, instantly, just in Miami, to allow people to evacuate from a hurricane. So electric cars will not take over the automotive industry just because they're electric. Because, you know, as much as we think we do, I don't think we all care about the planet that much, okay? We still want to drive fast cars. The bigger, the better. But the differentiation will be the service that companies like Tesla give you, especially in that example. That's what changes industries, not just technology. And it was interesting, 3 months ago, this was a very good example. 3 months ago, there was a experiment that was carried out to use artificial intelligence. Okay, artificial intelligence programmed robots to negotiate against each other. Okay, so there was an experiment, artificial intelligence. They programmed robots, and after, I think it took about 18 months, they sat these two robots together, and they were able to negotiate against each other. These robots sat together, they were able to negotiate. Unfortunately, after 10 minutes, the experiment was stopped. This was 3 months ago. Okay? The experiment was stopped after 10 minutes. And the reason why, I'll tell you why the experiment was stopped. Because after 10 minutes, these robots invented their own language and started negotiating with each other in their own language that they'd made up in 10 minutes. Because they're intelligent, and they're more intelligent than humans, obviously. So robots had already decided that, why are we negotiating in English? That's not the most efficient language to negotiate. Why are we using language? They invented their own very, very highly intelligent language to negotiate with. So that experiment had to be closed down. It's a true story. In the last 3 months. So the point I was trying to make with that is two things. First of all, negotiation is within the procurement and supply industry. This experiment was conducted, created, and executed by Facebook. We have to be careful to control the advances in our own profession, and we have to understand them. We have to understand blockchain. We have to understand all these advances, because otherwise they will be imposed upon us. And what we say in procurement, as I said before, is we say in this day and age, we are beyond cost savings. If all a procurement and supply chain team does is save costs, it's no longer relevant. Organizations want to see us managing risk, reducing risk, winning new business, adding social value, sustainability, green procurement. Organizations will look to your procurement team to start these initiatives. Transparency and integrity, and being relationship experts. And just to wrap up, as a final slide, just to say, how do we bring procurement and supply to that point where we're adding the value that is needed in this day and age, in 2017 towards 2018? We need to make sure we have all of these 5 things in place. We need to make managing risk a priority, the number one priority. If we do nothing else, we need to manage the risk in an organization. Even if we don't save costs, we need to manage risks. We need to maintain the integrity of an organization, because if the procurement and supply chain team cannot guarantee the integrity of the organization, then no one else can. We need to be innovative and create business solutions like Apple did. And importantly, we need to have the credibility and capability at all times. We have to evolve in our thinking. We have to be the people who think ahead and say, hold on a minute, we've got stockpiles of this commodity, but everyone is buying electric cars. So maybe we need to leverage against lithium. Or we need to say that this country is putting in place protectionist measures that is going to affect the cost of our supply chain. What is our mitigation strategy? And as long as we do that, we'll probably be okay. So good luck to you all implementing those things, and thank you very much.
شكرا سعادة الأستاذ أسامة شامبونغ فيكيبس، المدير الإقليمي للمعهد الملكي للمشتريات والتوريد لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال إفريقيا، وقد تحدث في عرضه المرئي عن منهجيات المشتريات المتقدمة من منظور دلالتها في التحكم والمراقبة لعمليات سلاسل الإمداد.